You know, it's fascinating, right? How one historical event, one single war, can produce completely different, totally honest stories from the people who were actually there. That's what we're digging into today, World War I, through the eyes of three men who lived it.
So, our story starts with a really simple, almost obvious fact. We've got two German veterans.
But here's the thing. They didn't just fight in the same war. They served on the exact same front. We're talking about the brutal Western Front. They saw the same trenches, the same mud, the very same devastation.
And okay, here's where the plot really thickens. A decade after the war ends, they both decide to publish their accounts, and they release them to the world in the very same year, 1929.
But their takeaways? They couldn't be more different. I mean, they're polar opposites. You've got Ernst Jünger, who described the war as this magnificent test of the human spirit. And then you have Erich Maria Remarque, who wrote what is arguably one of the most famous anti-war novels ever.
So how is that even possible? How can both of these things be true? They saw the same catastrophe. How did they come away with truths that are so completely, totally incompatible?
All right, let's meet our first witness. This is the man who found meaning in all that chaos, Ernst Jünger, who we'll call the warrior.
Now, Jünger's credibility here is, well, it's undeniable. He served on the Western Front for 4 long years. He was wounded, get this, 14 times. And he received Germany's highest military honor, the Pour le Mérite. This guy was in the thick of it, and he kept diaries the entire time.
And this is what is so wild about his perspective. For Jünger, that intense, life-or-death danger of a trench raid, it didn't paralyze him. No, he describes it as a moment of absolute clarity. He called it clean fear. It sharpened him. In fact, he said he had never felt more fully alive.
And look, this doesn't mean he was emotionless about death. Not at all. But he processed that loss through a really specific code of duty. For Jünger, breaking down and grieving in the field, that was a betrayal. The real way to honor your fallen friends was to endure, to persevere, to keep fighting.
Okay, so now let's turn to our second witness, who paints a completely different picture. This is Erich Maria Remarque, the mourner.
Remarque's path was very different. He was conscripted at just 18 years old. I mean, he was basically a kid thrown into the meat grinder. He only served for a short time before he was wounded, and his novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, was so powerfully anti-war, so deeply felt in its depiction of loss, that it was one of the very first books the Nazis threw onto their bonfires in 1933.
So think about this. Where Jünger found clarity, Remarque found this dehumanizing tidal wave of ferocity. For him, combat wasn't some noble test of spirit. It was a force that just stripped away your humanity and turned you into, in his words, thugs, murderers, devils.
And this really gets to the heart of his tragedy. For Remarque, the war didn't just kill soldiers. It killed the idea of a future for an entire generation. That line, "We believe in the war," is just one of the most devastating in all of literature. It means the war wasn't an event anymore. It was the only reality they had left.
So, we have the warrior's truth and the mourner's truth. Now let's bring in our third voice, this time from the other side of the trenches, the British poet Wilfred Owen. We'll call him the prophet, because he really delivers a moral verdict on the whole thing.
Owen's story is just absolutely heartbreaking. He was a British officer who experienced the war's psychological trauma, what we now call PTSD, firsthand. He found his incredible poetic voice while recovering in a hospital, and then he went back to the front, and he was killed in action. Just 1 week before the armistice was signed and the guns finally fell silent.
Now, to really get his most famous poem, you have to understand this one Latin phrase. It comes from the Roman poet Horace, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. And it was this big patriotic ideal that was drilled into schoolboys all over Europe. It means it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country.
So what Owen does is he just rips that ideal to shreds. He starts his poem by showing us the reality. This isn't a picture of proud soldiers marching off to glory. No, it's a vision of pure misery. He describes men bent double like old beggars, coughing like hags. They're literally marching in their sleep.
And then the poem descends into the central horror of the piece, a poison gas attack. And the imagery is just, it's brutal, it's visceral, it's traumatizing. He sees a fellow soldier drowning in the gas, and he says that in all his dreams, that image plunges at him, guttering, choking, drowning.
He doesn't just describe a death, he describes the unending nightmare of having seen it.
And that brings us to his final, damning verdict. He basically says to the reader, "My friend, if you had seen what I've seen, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori." He's not just calling it a lie, he's calling it the old lie, exposing this giant gaping chasm between patriotic slogans and the horrific reality of war. So there you have it, the warrior, the mourner, and the prophet. 3 completely honest accounts of the very same war. How on earth do we hold all of these truths together at the same time?
Well, let's just break it down one more time. You've got Younger, the warrior, whose core message is that combat reveals courage and endurance. You have Remarque, the mourner, telling us that the war just consumed a generation and stole its future. And then you have Owen, the prophet, who says the pity of war has to be named so we can expose the old lie.
And I think this is the most important takeaway. These truths aren't actually mutually exclusive. To give an honest accounting of a catastrophe like this, really any war, you have to be able to hold all 3 things in your head at once: the endurance, the loss, and the pity.
And that really makes you think, doesn't it? When we build monuments to war, when we tell the official stories, which voice do we usually choose to hear? Is it Junger's voice of endurance and courage, or do we make enough space for the mourner's grief and the prophet's warning?
Which leaves us with this one last big question. If 3 honest witnesses can disagree so completely, what is the true story of war? And maybe more importantly, what does that tell us about the nature of truth and history itself?